All right, everybody, welcome. We're going to get started here very quickly as we have a lot to cover tonight in terms of information, and I don't want to rush too much. So we'll just give everybody about 30 seconds to join here, and then we'll get going. I'm just going to make sure that I'm broadcasting live here. I'm going to check on my phone and make sure everything looks good. But yeah, we're going to get going here in just about a minute. If you have any questions, be sure to use the chat function there on the right, and I will try to answer them as I go along. Hopefully everybody's having a good evening. It's finally starting to see some sunlight out there after 5 o'clock, so it's making me feel pretty good. And if anybody notices any problems with the audio or anything, just let me know in the comment section. I can tweak my microphone here if you're getting any kind of feedback or anything. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here and get everything set up. So tonight's topic is going to be talking about how to locate kokanee. So this is probably one of the more difficult topics to cover, just because of the diversity of lakes that kokanee occupy naturally or are stocked into, but it's often one of the most common questions that I get. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So let's just cover the really easy ways to locate kokanee that I'm not going to spend a great bit of time on this evening, but obviously there's a ton of information on the internet now about kokanee fishing. There's tons of kokanee fishing forums and Facebook groups. So there's really no reason not to utilize those resources. Look at social media. I mean, one of the things I think I like most about kokanee fishing in general is just how generally positive and receptive the community is to sharing information. So don't be afraid to look in social media, check out regional newspapers and past reports too, because it tends to be areas that have held kokanee in the past will hold them in the future. Don't be afraid to ask, especially in private messages. Alternatively, you can just get to the lake and, monkey see, monkey do, and just follow the fleet and see where everybody else is going. The trick with that is that everybody's following that first boat, and who knows if they actually know where they're going. I've had many times where I've been out on Merwin and it's slow, and I get into a pike minnow bite and people see my net flying, and then I end up having a bunch of boats on top of me and I'm not catching any kokanee. And then also you can just visually locate fish, that is fish jumping on the surface in the spring, or you can just drive around and use your sonar too. But what I really want to cover today is finding kokanee by understanding kokanee. And that is, even if you know where to go kokanee, I think it's good to understand why kokanee are holding in these particular areas on the lake, and understanding the biology of that, and that will help you locate kokanee on other bodies of water and also in your same body of water as their distribution changes throughout the year. Of course, the most major influence to them is going to be their food, which is primarily zooplankton, which is impacted by seasonality, current, flow, and then this daily vertical migration, this diel vertical migration, which is something I'm going to really hammer home today. And then also they're very opportunistic. They will eat invertebrates like insect hatches as well. And then kokanee themselves, independent of their food resources, respond to current, changes in water temperature and dissolved oxygen, predation, migration, and then spawning as well. So we're going to cover all of these topics here. And so there's a lot of moving pieces here and a lot of complexity, but I think you'll come away from this evening with a little bit better understanding of what affects these fish's location and distribution on the lake and within the water column. And so in order to think about this, I want to sort of come at the what I'm calling the macro scale, this sort of the large landscape scale. These are areas that I know from Merwin that traditionally have always held kokanee for me. And I want you to understand, after we get finished here tonight, why are they holding in these different areas at different times of the year? What factors are causing them to concentrate in these areas in particular? So these are areas that, over time I just identified as holding fish during certain periods of time. And I also want to talk about this at the micro scale. And when I talk about the micro scale, I'm really talking about within the water column itself. What's the depth and what's causing them to move up and down through the water column throughout the year. So we're gonna break apart these two dynamics, right? This large scale versus the small scale. So if you find the kokanee in a lake, then location wise, then how do you zero in on them on the depth wise? So macro versus micro. And of course, this is really challenging because kokanee occupy this wide spectrum of bodies of water. So I say at one end of the spectrum, we have these massive reservoirs that are 30, 40, 50 miles long that lie on major river systems. And they're affected by current and dam releases and everything, right? So they're large flowing reservoirs. And then we have small lakes like this is Blue Mesa Reservoir in Colorado where we have the flow, so that's the current coming down there. And then we have like small tiny lakes like Deep Lake here in central Washington where there's essentially no current. It's just spring-fed, surface water fed, very deep. And so this is the other end of that spectrum, right? And of course, most kokanee lakes are going to fall somewhere in this spectrum, in the middle, on the far end, or on that small stagnant end. And so I really want to break apart these two different types of bodies of water to help inform you on where kokanee would occur. So let's start with the big, large flowing reservoirs. These are the more classic, popular kokanee fisheries because they tend to be highly productive in terms of kokanee, and they support really large fisheries. And so during the spring, what we're coming up on now, a lot of the reservoirs are going to be moving into drawdown phase. They're going to be making space for water for the oncoming melt of snow that's going to come out of the mountains during the spring. And this is going to cause water flowage to increase through the reservoir as they start to draw down, and you will start to get a higher concentration of zooplankton, that is the food for kokanee, near the dam. There's a couple reasons for this. First of all, water near the dams is the oldest water in the reservoir, right? So water's coming in at the top of the reservoir through the tributary rivers, and it's moving down reservoir. And as it's going along, it's gathering sunlight, and the zooplankton, you can break into two communities. There's the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. The phytoplankton, which is this algae, is gathering energy from the sun and converting that into sugars, and that provides the base of the food chain for zooplankton like copepods and daphnia and things that kokanee feed on. And so that concentration of phytoplankton is greater as you go down reservoir, especially during drawdown. And that's just because that's where the oldest water is. And so the kokanee are going to follow that food resource. And so you will see in many reservoirs that as the drawdown continues through the spring, you'll get a greater and greater concentration or movement of kokanee down towards the dam. You see this in Lake Roosevelt. You see this in Lake Chelan. You see this in Flaming Gorge. You see this in Blue Mesa. It's repeated over and over again in many of the lakes that I fish. And this is why I really encourage people to think about kokanee reservoirs, these large flowing reservoirs, as big, slow rivers rather than lakes. And this flow and current has a major impact on the distribution of zooplankton. And it also can impact the concentration through too, not just because of abundance of food resources, but also because zooplankton can't really swim. So because of their small size, the viscosity of water, that is the thickness of water, it's to them swimming through the water is like swimming through like honey. It's very thick and viscous to them. And so they can't move like miles. They can only move, 40, 50, 60 feet in a day. And so they have really limited ability to move long distances. So they're really just going with the flow. And what will happen is in these flowing reservoirs is you'll get eddies because water is flowing through the reservoirs down towards the dam. You're going to get these eddies behind points and in coves, and zooplankton are going to get trapped in these eddies and concentrate there, not only because their food resources are getting trapped there. So if water gets trapped there, then it's getting able to absorb more energy from the sun. You're getting more phytoplankton. Zooplankton are going to go to where the food is, and then they're going to get stuck in there because it's just swirling around. And so I saw this at Strawberry Reservoir where, off of Hawes Point here, we have flow coming from the north. And behind these points is very frequently where I'll find kokanee, especially during drawdown periods, because you get these large eddies. Likewise, down here north of Chipman Creek, in this large cove, I found large numbers of kokanee in a very small area because I believe that they're taking advantage of these eddies where food resources are concentrated. So a key takeaway here is to think about these types of resources getting trapped in these flowing systems. And the longer the drawdown goes, the more fish are going to get pulled towards the dam. So like I'll see, especially at Lake Roosevelt, during big flow years, you get more and more and more fish getting concentrated further down towards the dam as the drawdown goes. And then eventually they stop dumping water and they start filling the reservoir, and the impacts of that flow diminish. And the fish start to spread out because the zooplankton is no longer getting as concentrated because the amount of time the water is spending in the reservoir is longer and longer. So there's more food resources available, more spread out. And also, I think, kokanee themselves are impacted or affected by flow. So they have an anadromous history built into their genetics. And I think kokanee, just like sockeye, sometimes they just want to go with the flow. And that's why we'll see a lot of fish entrain or go over the tops of dams or through turbines during big flowage years because they just have that instinct to swim out to sea. These older fourth-year fish, I don't see it as much, but they do move over these dams. So as these lakes fill, or if you're fishing a lake that doesn't really have strong flow, then these influences of current aren't really applicable. And so things that might become more influential now are things like stream inflows of smaller streams, springs, turbidity. So, turbidity is going to reduce the ability of phytoplankton to get sunlight. And so if you have turbid areas of the lake, they'll tend to hold less kokanee. Wind can play a really significant factor here on distribution of food resources. Generally, you're going to get more zooplankton concentration on the windward side of the lake, or the biological factors of kokanee themselves. That is their need for certain temperatures, dissolved oxygen, are going to play a much greater role here. And so one of the things I really want to drive home here, this is a little shot of a lake to the north of me, and it has a sort of classic kokanee lake basin. So there's a large main basin that most kokanee anglers are going to troll right up and down the middle of this 35, 40-foot basin. And that's where the kokanee are most of the time because there's not a lot of flow in this lake. And I've been up there, though, multiple times, and I'll go out there, and there's just very few fish out in the middle of the lake. And I'm like, where did they go? They were here a few weeks ago. I would get a limit in an hour. And I would see these big bug hatches, these chironomid hatches, mayfly hatches, and midge hatches up in the shallows, and I would see little fish sipping them off the surface, and I'm thinking they must be trout because they plant a lot of trout in there. And I go over there and I just troll through there and I start picking up kokanee in 8 foot of water. And this has happened multiple times where I will find these fish moving up and opportunistically taking advantage of a bulkier, protein-rich meal like a big bug hatch. So just because you see, trout sipping off the bugs off the surface, there might be kokanee feeding underneath there too. So don't overlook that, especially if the kokanee sort of vanish from where you traditionally find them. I do just want to make a quick plug. This year I've moved away from doing the sponsorships, so I'm doing more of these live events, and so I really appreciate any support you can offer. You can always hit that little thanks button at the end of this if you find these useful and make a one-time donation, or you can check out my Patreon or links below, or join community. And I'm going to do some cool Patreon and community member fish meetups across the Northwest this year. So it'll be an opportunity to meet one-on-one and do some fishing together. I think that'll be really fun. All right, I'm going to keep moving on. Now let's sort of zero in a little bit on depth, and then we're going to come back to location again. So I really want to emphasize on depth before we get into talking about late summer and stratification spawning. So this is sort of that micro scale. So diel vertical migration, or I'm going to call it DVM, is such an important influence to kokanee and their food. And so we see on this little diagram here, during the daytime, the sun's energy is getting pumped into the upper surface of the water, and the little green things here, which is the phytoplankton, they're converting that energy into sugars and releasing oxygen into the water. Those are all good things. But the zooplankton, the things that kokanee feed on, have moved down deeper into the water column. They may be doing that because they're seeking greater oxygen concentration. A major reason they're doing it is to avoid predation, because there's like predatory copepods that are eating other zooplankton, and so they're just trying to get somewhere where it's harder for predators to see them, including trout and kokanee. So they go to a darker area. And then at night, those zooplankton move to the surface and feed on that algae, right? So they make this daily vertical migration. Usually it's not much more than, like I said, 20 to 30 feet, 40 feet max, okay? But they're doing this every day. This is one of the greatest migrations that occurs every day on this planet. There is metric tons upon tons of plankton moving up and down in the water column on this planet every day. And they do it in our little lakes too. And what's really interesting is that kokanee do the exact same thing, primarily to follow their food resources, but other biological factors play a role. And also they want to avoid predation as well. I'm sure you've noticed this when you get really glassy days. The kokanee will just drop just a little bit, even when the surface temperatures are ideal for surface feeding. And that is because, in those glassy days, it makes it really easy for predators like bald eagles and ospreys to pick them off. But if you get a little chop on the water, then all of a sudden they come right back up and start feeding. And this graph here is, they radio collared radio tagged, I guess I should say, kokanee at Lake Roosevelt, and it recorded their depth throughout the day. And so you can see on this kokanee, classic DVM. So in the mornings, he's up on the surface, and then he drops down at midday to about 10, these are in meters here on the left. So he's going anywhere from 6 to 15 feet deep during the daylight, and then at night he's coming back up and surface feeding, and then dropping back down in the mornings. Right around 7 a.m. he drops down to around 3 meters, so that's about 10, 12 feet, and then back up again. They just repeat this time and time again. And I'm sure as a kokanee angler, you've encountered this where you get out in the morning, they're on the surface feeding, the sun comes out, the fish drop. They're just mimicking this exact behavior. And of course, other factors play a really key role here, and that includes water temperature, dissolved oxygen, disturbance from motor noise, I think, is a really big factor that can push fish down, especially in high pressure fisheries. And we see this especially when they're near surface feeding. You know, guys are really starting to capitalize on the use of these planer boards and things like that in long distance flatlining because of this disturbance of motor noise. And then spawning behavior is also going to impact this as well. But water temperature and dissolved oxygen are probably the single most important factor when it comes to warm conditions. So midsummer to late summer on these smaller lakes that don't have flow, they're going to stratify. Most of the Kokanee lakes, especially here in Washington, will stratify heavily, especially those on the east side of the Columbia Basin. And then you see this really commonly throughout the interior western lakes. If they don't have a lot of current, they will stratify as the summer moves on. And so it's good to understand that there's this super strong relationship between dissolved oxygen, solubility of oxygen, and water and temperature. So as water temperature goes up, as you see here on the bottom here, as water temperature goes up, dissolved oxygen goes down, and that's just because water can't hold dissolved oxygen at higher temps. So Kokanee really are cold water specialists, and in part because of the requirements of their oxygen requirements. They require high quantities of oxygen. So their temperature requirements are 45 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Optimal is right around 53. So that's what all their enzymes and proteins, that's how they operate best at. And above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, they start to stress. And so understanding this makes it the easiest way to locate Kokanee depth, especially on these stratified lakes. And so lakes will split into these three different layers: the epilimnion, the metalimnion, and hypolimnion. And we often talk about this just as the thermocline, right? And the thermocline really isn't a distinct line. I think a lot of fishermen get hung up on this idea that there's just a line that's a thermocline, whereas really the thermocline is just this gradient of warmer to cooler water before it hits a very dense cold layer of water, very cold oxygen poor water called the hypolimnion. And for most cases, Kokanee are going to be hanging out just above this thermocline, right in which I define as this area between the metalimnion and hypolimnion. Okay, so that's this green to blue transition. And to better illustrate these different layers, the epilimnion, which is the hottest water that's right up on the surface, it's actually fairly oxygen rich, even though it's warmer, because there's a lot of oxygen mixing in because of waves and wind are churning the water up. And also you have lots of algae here undergoing photosynthesis, and they're releasing dissolved oxygen into the water. So the epilimnion, despite being fairly warm, is fairly oxygen rich, right near the surface. And this is the area that when you go swimming, it feels nice and warm in the summertime, like bath water. And then if you go up and you get on the dock and you jump through in that dock, and then all of a sudden you hit that colder water below, you're moving into the metalimnion. And that is this ever decreasing layer of cooler and cooler water as you go down. Now, oxygen is still relatively rich here because you're getting some mixing between the epilimnion and metalimnion, just naturally as this water heats up and goes up and mixes with the epilimnion. So you're getting a fair amount of oxygen here, but it's not enough to allow that hot water to penetrate deeper. And then as you get down towards the base of this metalimnion, all of a sudden you'll just hit this extremely cold temperature gradient where the temperature will just plummet. And there's almost no oxygen down here in this hypolimnion. It's totally anaerobic, anoxic environment. I've actually did a video on this where I dropped a camera down. You can see all the zooplankton like packed into the metalimnion. And then as soon as I hit the hypolimnion, there's nothing. It's like a ghost town. There's just no oxygen there, and the zooplankton need oxygen. And so you can actually see this boundary between that anoxic cold layer at the bottom of the lake and the warmer one above it by turning up the sensitivity on your fish finder. some people have problems with this. You just need to alter your frequencies, just tinker with it a little bit. It will show up on there, especially just push up the gain. It'll either look like a line or like a dense cloud, and you can see it here. I have it labeled. You see this cloudy area at the bottom, that's the thermocline. That's the area that has no oxygen down there. That's the cold anoxic water. And just above that is usually where the kokanee are going to hang out. It's right above that or right on that line. And as you can see there's my downrigger weight, the constant line. Then you see all those kokanee scattered just about 5 or 6 feet above the hypolimnion. And here's another example. So these are all from different lakes. Again, you can see the kokanee there stacked right on the hypolimnion, metalimnion boundary. And there's a couple kokanee above it. And that's where generally I'm going to put my downriggers, right above that line, and draw those fish up or to my gear. Here's another example, right? So you always see this sort of cloudy area. If you crank up your gain, you're going to see this cloudy area. And then here's this big school of kokanee stacked right on top. If you don't have a fish finder or you're struggling to pick up this break of the thermocline on your fish finder, you can also pick up these Fishhawk temperature depth sensors. These things are great. You can just clip them onto your downrigger or onto a fishing line, drop them down, and it'll record the temperature every 5 feet for you. And you can identify that 54-degree zone, and it works perfect. Like, I don't know how many times I would go out and there wasn't strong enough of a thermocline in the early part of the season. And I would drop this down there and I would find that 54-degree temperature gradient, and that's where I'd start my gear, even though I wasn't marking fish, and I would start catching fish before I marked fish. So this is a great and handy tool. All right, so just a quick recap, because I mean that's a lot of information in a short amount of time. Lakes will stratify from the surface. You have the epilimnion, which is often lethally hot for kokanee, especially on really well stratified lakes. And then you have the upper metalimnion, which is stressfully warm, but zooplankton are moving up out of this lower metalimnion into the upper metalimnion and even epilimnion to feed at night, because that's where the algae is. They have to. Kokanee will venture up into this zone. So I've been out in many mornings where it is 62, 61 degrees Fahrenheit at 15, 20 feet, and I will still catch kokanee there at that water temperature. That is high stress temperatures, but they're just moving up temporarily to feed on zooplankton, and then they're retreating back down into these cooler optimal temperatures in the lower metalimnion, and they're just using this as a refuge and then making forays up into that warmer water. As the day goes on, they tend to hold deeper and deeper and get into that ideal water temperature as the day progresses, and the water temperature gets hotter and hotter as the day progresses. The lower metalimnion is the ideal temperatures for them, where they can go and be comfortable, and then they'll also daytime feed there. So I'll do a lot better later in the day, fishing right above that hypolimnion where they do not venture. They traditionally will not go deep into the hypolimnion. It's just not enough oxygen there for them. So you're probably thinking, that's great. Now I have a better understanding of why kokanee are at different depths. So how does that help me locate kokanee on the lake overall, on a stratified lake? And the key thing I want you to take away here is that you should target the largest deep water basin in the lake that you're fishing. Basically, kokanee get trapped in these deep water basins as thermal refuges until the fall, when the lake turns over, cools off and turns over. And I've noticed many times, there are many lakes that I fish that have multiple basins. Usually you'll have one really large basin, and sometimes you'll have like a smaller basin that might even be deeper. And I'll go and venture over and fish those small deep basins, and I almost never find nearly as many kokanee as I do in the largest basins. So target the largest basins first. They will almost always hold more fish just by this natural phenomena where fish are moving around the lake and they're finding that as the largest, safest place to be that is just where you're going to end up with more fish naturally through time just by the laws of probability. Additionally, if you have any kind of wind, you want to target the windward side of that basin, as it's more likely to have more oxygen mixing. You're likely to have greater concentrations of organic matter, food, phytoplankton, zooplankton, right? So you're just following the food in the appropriate water temperature and dissolved oxygen content, essentially. So this is my advice in terms of a major takeaway for stratified lakes, how to locate fish. So this is West Hill Pond in Connecticut. We fished it. We went down to the lower basin. We found no fish in the smaller, deeper basin, but the bigger basin, that's where we were finding all of our fish on the windward side. And that was consistent the whole time that we were there, predominant northwest wind. As far as the fish hawk TD models, they have a bunch of models. I just like the little basic TD model. I'll put a link. It should be linked in the description to this video, and it just fits in your pocket. It's super easy. I carry it in my PFD, and I just clip it on and drop it down all the time. Similarly, going back to this big basin versus small basin discussion, here's Curlew Lake. I've gone up in Kokanee, fished it a few times. There's a big basin in the north end and a smaller basin in the central part of the lake. Again, even though the central basin is a little bit deeper overall in terms of average, the north basin always holds the fish, and that's just a constant pattern that I've seen. Of course, there's also the confounding issue of spawning, right? And so most of us are fishing for fourth-year fish because those are the largest fish, and thus they're going to give us the most meat. And so that's the fish we really want to catch. Of course, these are the ones that are going to spawn in the fall, and the spawning times of kokanee varies widely across the West. I'm astonished at how early like Lake Chelan fish will start spawning in August, whereas like some fish that I target, like on Lake Pend Oreille and here on some of the lakes in Okanagan County, they won't spawn until October, like mid-October, sometimes as late as November. So it's really varied. So you need to understand what the spawning times are by your lake. But these fish are going to start migrating out of these basins, especially as the thermal barriers break down, and moving towards their spawning grounds. That might be a natural spawning ground, either shore spawning, or they might be swimming up a river or creek to spawn. They might be moving to a hatchery, or they might just be going to the point in the lake where they were dumped in as fry. So a lot of fish will just return to the ramp because most Fish and Game just pull up to the ramp and dump them out. And so those fish will move back up into those shallow areas around the ramps. This process of moving and staging will begin in late summer, oftentimes when they're still in very good condition for harvest. They're still very chrome. They're starting to get elongation of their nose, a little bit of a hump on the back, but otherwise they're still chrome. Their eggs haven't really started to get that large yet, and the males have only just started to elongate their milt sacs. So there's still really good opportunity to harvest these fish during this staging period. And it's been my experience that they will usually concentrate at the deepest, coldest spot closest in proximity to where they are going to spawn or run up to spawn. So, for example, like at West Hill Pond, where I was in Connecticut, they were already starting to stage up. And they dump them all in on the north end of the lake up here at this West Hill Pond boat launch. And almost like all the fourth-year fish, the bigger fish, were concentrating right up here on this ledge on the northeast side of the lake. Likewise, Deep Lake, which I have sort of turned funky here, like up here by where my head is, that's where the boat ramp is. And, the fourth-year fish will all start to concentrate on this deep water ledge right before it moves up into a big shallow cove in the fall, because they are waiting to transition into that spawning phase, and then they're going to move up right where they were dumped into the lake. And this is my favorite time to go out and jig these fish, because This is from West Hill Pond, but I have tons of footage on jigging for deep Lake Kokanee. You get these just massive schools of fourth year fish just stacked up um, on these ledges, right on along these ledges, and so it just makes for really easy pickings, especially at a time when a lot of folks aren't really targeting kokanee. So, likewise, you have to also think about in larger rivers, larger flowing systems. Like here we have Lake Merwin. This little cove here is called Spilei Cove, and at the top of this cove is where the hatchery is, where Spilei Creek is, where all these fish originate, or a lot of these fish originate. And so these fish will often stage late summer, fall, right here at the entrance to the cove. And it always blew my mind when I go up there and fish for these kokanee late season is everybody's pulling out of the boat ramp, which is right there, and then they're like driving 100 miles an hour out, and they're just going right over the top over like where the greatest school of kokanees are. And I would just sit there and do figure eights, much to the chagrin of all the powerboat anglers trying to come out of there, and just wipe out a 10 fish limit just in no time. And that's just because there's so many fish stacked right here in front of this cove, just waiting to make that run up. Similarly, at Blue Mesa Reservoir, you know, these fish have to run 30, 40 miles up the Gunnison River to go to the Roaring Judy fish hatchery to spawn. And so they will stage on the east end of the lake in late summer, early fall, before they make that run up. In fact, I've shore fished here throwing little spinners and spoons and caught just dime bright fourth year fish kokanee right here. That's where I actually caught my very first kokanee doing that, just throwing a pink rooster tail off the rocks right there by the bridge, back when the reservoir actually had water. I'm sure it's different now, but they still stage up in this basin right here in front of the river, which is interesting because during early in summer, most of them are way down by the dam where it's deeper and colder because that's where the flow has drawn most of the zooplankton resources. But they're not focused on feeding anymore in this late season pattern. They're more focused on getting ready to spawn. So just in summary here, there's a lot I covered, but in flowing reservoirs, fish are going to concentrate towards the dam, and eddies can trap and concentrate food and kokanee. So during these flow periods on these larger reservoirs, think about how much water are they dumping, how long have they been dumping water, and are there any areas that are likely to create back eddies, any coves or large points. During low flow or in unstratified lakes, fish are going to spread out. The kokanee depth is going to be driven by their diel vertical migration and also going to be driven by water temperatures. So even though the lake's not stratified yet, there's still going to be some optimal temperature in there. It might not be on the surface. It might be at 10 feet, might be at 15 feet. You just got to find it, okay? If there's just a uniform, mid 50s from surface down, then they're generally going to be near surface because that's where the phytoplankton and zooplankton are going to be. I think Fontenelle is a really good example of this. It's fed by the Green River year-round. It stays cold. The kokanee just stay on the surface the whole time. They almost never drop. And they're also going to be opportunistic and take advantage of those short-lived bug hatches to really pack on some weight. And then in stratified lakes, they're going to concentrate in the larger basins, and they're going to be tightly associated with that thermocline, especially after you get out of that initial feeding frenzy in the early morning. And then in pre-spawn and spawning times, they're going to migrate towards their spawning grounds, stage in the nearest, deepest cold waters until they transition into spawn phase, and then they're going to move up into those areas and spawn and then die. Often at this time, they'll be in very dense schools. So that's the major takeaways I wanted to lay out for you today. It's a lot to cover. I'm going to go ahead now and jump into some of the questions that I'm seeing on the chats and get to them. Let's see here. So Trevor talks about that you need to be right at the bottom end of the thermocline you'll catch rainbows. This is true. Rainbow trout have a wider temperature tolerance than kokanees. Kokanee are a little more picky when it comes to temperature, and this is why, like especially when I'm fishing some of the lakes around here in Okanagan County that get a lot of rainbow trout plants, guys are catching rainbows, and they ask why am I catching kokanee. I just say just go a little bit deeper. You can. There's always got to punch through that rainbow trout layer. And remember, rainbow trout feed on larger prey items, but they also feed on copepods and some larger zooplankton. And so they're going to be targeting those larger predators right on that sort of upper metalimnion where the temperatures are maybe 56, 57, 58. They can tolerate that. They're going to be in there feeding, whereas the kokanee are going to be pushed a little bit deeper, looking for that optimal cold water. Let's see here. Iron Albatross asks, this will be my first year going for kokanee. What is the good first-time lake in the spring? Well, it really depends on where you're at. I would look for lakes that have a very good surface bite in the spring. Not all of them do, but some lakes in particular that I really like are Merwin, and primarily because they feed near the surface there. And then down in Oregon, I really like Detroit because they'll feed relatively shallow in the spring. Also, smaller lakes are also a really good choice. If you can find like a smaller stocked kokanee lake, that's a great place to learn because it's less area to sort of figure out where the fish are distributed. And then, strawberry is a good one because they tend to be near surface in the spring. It's a very cold water reservoir. Same with Flaming Gorge. You're just long lining them on the surface. Let's see here. Iron Albatross said he's been looking at Wallowa Lake. That's a really good choice. Troll the north end of the lake in the spring with little to no weight, and you'll find some really nice fish. Interestingly, I'll always find like third-year fish out deeper even in the spring, but the fourth-year fish will be feeding shallow. Todd asks, how far will they travel when the lake is flowing or filling and slow? So what I've noticed, like a good example would be like Flaming Gorge or like Roosevelt or Chelan. Those fish are traveling, upwards of 20 to 30, 40 miles during the spring as they get moved down lake, and then they'll redistribute pretty quickly within about 30 to 40 days and spread back out. They don't tend to end up as far upstream in the summer as they do in the wintertime, but over the wintertime, those third-year fish can end up, sometimes 50, 60 miles away from the dam where they may have been in the beginning of the year. And there's some cool radio tracking studies out of Lake Roosevelt that show these fish. Some of them move over 110 miles in just a few months. So they can move really long distances. Thing about people are always frustrated with Lake Roosevelt, and it's just because those fish do cover huge distances. They're not high density in there. There's no more planting of hatchery fish because they never represented a huge percentage of the fishery. So it's a lot about understanding their distribution there and the seasonal movement of those fish relative to flows. Chris asks, do you notice any distribution differences among age class? Absolutely. So I was just talking about Wallowa Lake. I find the fourth-year fish tend to move shallower and feed shallower, longer into the day and earlier in the season, and the smaller fish will stay out deeper. I'm not sure what drives that behavior, if they're displacing them, if it's an aggression thing, or a predator avoidance thing because they're smaller and they feel like they can be eaten. And being out over the big deep water basins keeps them away from the macks that are cruising along those ledges there. But I do catch a lot of Mackinaw, surprisingly, on the surface at Wallowa Lake. I can't believe how many I've caught. And they could be up there chasing smaller kokanee, and that might be why the big schools stay out further away. Mark asks, how can you determine when the lake is being drained? You should be able to find information online through Bureau of Reclamation or Army Corps, whoever's managing that dam. They should have data updated daily on how much they're letting out in terms of water flow. At what surface temp do I start long lining in the spring? Pretty much, I am always long lining on the surface in the spring until water temps get above 54, and then I start dropping deeper. Let's see. I have not fished Lake Samish, but I really want to. What is my most used lure for kokanee? Hands down, I'm always fishing micro hoochies. They're my go-to. And if I had to pick a favorite color, I'd probably say pink purple is my go-to. I don't have any plans to hit Fish Lake this year because I've got other plans, and I'm headed back to Flaming Gorge at the end of June. I need some redemption on that lake from the kayak. I didn't have a great success on the kayak there. I did well on the powerboat, but I really want to get some from the kayak. Yes, under the ice, you can assume that you're going to get a similar distribution of zooplankton because there's still light coming through the lakes. Now the amount of production going on is really subdued, but you're still going to have this daily vertical migration underneath the ice. Let's see what else we got. Alder, I do want to try alder at some point. I know it's a really good kokanee fishery. And Stevens, I need to make like a Seattle kokanee run at some point. I know that they were catching really big ones though at Fish Lake in Utah on the surface. I see Eric's gonna head back down there. I've never fished Loon or Sullivan or Davis for kokanee. I know they have lots of small fish there. And they do a lot of still fishing on some of those lakes too. I really want to try it. I am planning on going to British Columbia this year, so I'll be hitting the Caribou and some of the southern Okanagan Valley lakes for kokanee. Austin asks, when do we start kokanee fishing in Western Washington? You can start. I mean, every year I made it a tradition to go out. When I lived in Southwest Washington, I would spend my New Year's on Lake Merwin and many times caught a limit. So you can get out there right now. They are catching them. In early season, after ice off, do I prefer larger or smaller presentations? I generally fish micro hoochies, so I'm generally going with small presentations. The only time I really go large is late summer when fish are deep, and that's when I'll start running things like kokanee cut plugs and things like that. As far as winter tactics for jigging through the ice, the main things, the three ways I'll target kokanee through the ice is jigging spoons, jigging a dodger with a small pink tungsten jig underneath it about 12 inches, or I'll use a sabiki rig with a small spoon on the bottom. That's what the Japanese do. They love jigging for kokanee using sabiki rigs and spoons. I don't have a ton of experience on Lakewood or American Lake. I know they do have bigger kokanee in American Lake, though. Real James Taylor asks, do I find larger kokanee stick together and smaller ones below them? Yeah, I do say that larger fish tend to be shallower and smaller fish, and they do segregate by size class. It seems like I'll get into certain size classes at certain depths. You can definitely cast and retrieve for kokanee using Castmasters or jigs. I want to do a video this year on casting for jumpers in the spring. John Matthews asks about Whiskeytown. I did a video on Whiskeytown last summer. I went there in May. It was lights out. It's a really good kokanee fishery. See, Board Guys 23 asks, what lakes do I recommend near Spokane that are consistent for kokanee fishing? I think that Loon is probably one of your best bets, and Sullivan to the north and Davis. I think Sullivan's probably a better choice. They've got a ton of smaller fish in there. There's also a few lakes down by Cheney that have them too that you should look into that might be opportunistic for you. Lucas asks, do I use corn while trolling, or do I put on one hook, or both hooks, or just one? I almost always run corn or Berkeley Gulp. I've run them both side by side. I don't notice a difference. I treat both of them with scent, and I put one on each hook, just one bait. So you don't want to overload it because I like to keep my baits light so that it really gets tossed side to side. Dean asks, what's the cheapest long amp hour lithium battery for my 103 Minn Kota? You should look at the Chins batteries on Amazon. I think they're like down to $300 or $400 for a 100 amp hour lithium battery, and I've seen some teardowns in them. The cells are solid and the BMS systems are good. And then I'll get one more question here, and then I'm going to take off and let you guys go for the evening. I got J Hag there asks, what is the spot on Crane in Oregon? And so Crane Prairie is one of the weirdest kokanee fisheries on the planet because that lake is like barely 10 feet deep at its deepest. You have to find the old riverbeds. If not, you end up on top of the weed beds. I didn't catch any, but if you follow the old river channels, fortunately I had good maps, and I just followed those old river channels, and that's where all the kokanee were. All right, folks, that's going to do it for me. We'll be back next month with another live kokanee chat. Thanks again for all your support and all the awesome questions. And I'll see you guys out there. Just remember, fish smarter, not harder. Bye, guys.